hello and welcome. This is new research how adult educators can help learners prepare for today's workforce. And Amanda Bergson-Shilcox is joining us. Thank you to all of our sponsors for making this session possible. Wisconsin Literacy is a nonprofit literacy coalition with member agencies from all around the state. We work together to strengthen literacy in every community. Our collaboration broadens opportunities for learners and creates a more literate and equitable Wisconsin. So a couple of housekeeping items. As you can see, this session is being recorded. Please mute yourself to keep down background noise. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. And be sure to stay on this session after the presentation for a 15-minute lightning solutions session from Cambridge University, and you'll have a chance to learn more about their products and win a great prize. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Amanda Bergson-Shilcock, who is joining us from the East Coast, and she is with National Skills Coalition, where she leads the organization's work in adult education and workforce policies. Throughout her career, Amanda has worked with policymakers and skills advocates to develop policy solutions that address the challenges facing adult learners and job seekers. As a workforce development expert, Amanda has authored numerous publications and policy recommendations which have helped to inform public policy in the state and federal levels. So thank you, Amanda, for being with us today.
Thanks so much, Robin. I'm excited to be joining you all. And hello from snowy Philadelphia. It probably doesn't sound like too much to those of you in Wisconsin, but we got 14 inches of snow yesterday, so that does feel like a lot to us. As Robin said, I'm about to share a fair bit of information with you. If you are the kind of person who likes to take notes, good news, you're going to have access to the slides afterwards. So you don't have to feel like you have to kind of frantically scribble things down. And if you're the kind of person that likes people in stories rather than notes and statistics, good news, there's lots of people in stories in this presentation. So, and I've left a good chunk of time at the end for questions, but don't hesitate to drop them in the chat as we go, just to get the questions out there. Okay. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about National Skills Coalition and why we did these studies. I'm going to walk you through what we heard from small businesses and then from learners and workers, and talk in both cases about, okay, this data is all fine and good, but how can adult educators actually use this data, especially in an environment where, as all of us know really, really well, we had to fight hard to get our federal funding last year. We're going to probably have to fight hard again in the coming year to get continuation of federal funding. There's the opportunity of Workforce Pell on the horizon, but that's also complicated and will take a little bit to roll out. So it's a complex environment right now. And my hope is that this data will help you advocate for adult education and adult learners. So we are a 25-year-old nonprofit organization. We are entirely funded by foundations and donations, so we don't accept public funding, which allows us to stay independent to government in making policy recommendations. We are a Big Tent, bipartisan coalition of education and workforce advocates, business and labor leaders, and state and local officials and agency staff. So why did we do these two studies that I'm about to tell you about? We recognize that there were a couple of things going on at the national level. There were a variety of different state efforts to track and evaluate quality non-degree credentials. And for those of you who are running integrated education and training programs, you are deeply familiar with the world of non-degree credentials because generally speaking, in an IET program, a person might be earning that phlebotomy certificate or that data analysis certificate or that electrician pre-apprenticeship certificate, whatever it might be. It's not a 2-year degree, not a 4-year degree, but hopefully a quality non-degree credential. At the same time, there were also these efforts, and several dozen governors have signed executive orders around this, around skills-based hiring. The idea of like, okay, what if we removed bachelor's degree requirements from jobs? Would we be able to access a higher pool of applicants and actually find people whose skills matched what we were looking for? So those two things were going on, and we really wanted to understand if these trends were affecting small businesses and workers or if they weren't. And so we asked two questions. We asked how small businesses were approaching hiring and skills assessment, and then how learners and workers were approaching their decisions about skills training. So what did we find? I'm going to talk first about our small business study. And just to emphasize here, we know that a lot of adult learners enroll in education because they either want to get a job or get a better job. And so when we think about employment from an adult education lens, we're thinking about, okay, this is an environment that many of our learners are either already navigating. Maybe they're working as home health aides. Maybe they're doing gig work, delivering food, or, being an Instacart shopper. Maybe they are working in a small manufacturing company or a small construction company. Or it might be a world that our learners are hoping to enter, right? Maybe our learners are home right now raising kids or caring for an elderly or disabled family member, but they hope to re-enter the workforce at a future point. And for those of us running corrections education programs, the example could be that, in prison, they may or may not have employment, but when they return home, employment will be a really important aspect of making sure that they don't end up right back in incarceration. So when we started this project, we did these interviews with businesses in April and May of last year, which is when the first tariff announcements were getting rolled out. And frankly, I thought a lot of people might just be like, we don't have time to talk to you. We were pleasantly shocked. 98% of the people we reached out to were eager to talk to us about their challenges and opportunities in hiring entry-level workers. We talked to ultimately 75 small businesses, including some in Wisconsin, located across the US and primarily in manufacturing and construction industries. We picked those industries because they're kind of a middle ground in terms of credentials. So if you think of credentialing for entry-level workers, at one end of the spectrum, you have jobs in retail, and lots of those jobs don't require any kind of credential, right? You can think of your learners who have a job as a stocking clerk or a cashier or entry-level food service. They might not need to have any credential in order to get that job. At the other end of the spectrum, you have jobs in healthcare. And healthcare is highly regulated. And so even the most entry-level roles as a patient care technician or a dietary aide or a home health aide often require some kind of credential. So we thought, let's pick one that's a middle ground, that's more reflective of the other industries in this country that sometimes require a credential and sometimes don't. And that's how we ended up with manufacturing and construction. And typically, we either spoke with the CEO at the company or a senior HR person. We chose these industries because they exist in every state and community across the US, certainly including Wisconsin. And at the time of our survey, they were hiring steadily. So, what did we find? We really found things that you can kind of group into two categories. The first is what businesses want policymakers to do. And I know a handful of folks listening today are at state agencies or possibly local municipal agencies. Many of you are at community colleges or nonprofit organizations. These are findings you can point to when you're making the case for why we need increased funding for adult education. And then the second half of our findings really had to do with the practices of small businesses. How do they go about hiring and assessing the skills of workers? And these are findings that you can use more internally in your program design and when you're doing outreach to potential learners. So let's walk through both of those. And I'm just taking a second to look at the chat to make sure, okay, it doesn't seem like there's any questions popping up there. So what do businesses want to see state leaders do? We got some very frank advice from businesses. And one of the first findings is really powerful for us as adult educators. They want to see more support for foundational skills, including math, English, and technology related skills. This is a great finding, right? It allows you to be able to talk to your governor's office, your state agency leaders, your federal officials, your private funders, whoever you might need to say, small businesses see the value of adult education. And I think that's critically important. We also heard a lot of requests around first line supervisors, right? And so an awful lot of people told us, oh, I hired somebody and they're good as a general worker, or their technical skills are fine, or Joe really knows how to use this robotics machine. But then I promote them, and it turns out actually they don't have the written and spoken communication skills, or the teamwork and collaboration skills, or the people management skills that they need to be successful as a first line supervisor. Now, again, some of us are already serving first line supervisors as adult learners in our classrooms, and some of us have adult learners who are aspiring to be promoted into these roles. And again, this is ammunition that you can use in advocating for more funding to support adult education programs that can help people build these kind of skills. We also heard a lot of requests specifically around digital skills. And I want to dwell on this for just a second because there's an awful lot of news headlines out there right now about AI and the impact on the labor market. We mostly heard much more practical and earlier stage digital skills, right? So people would say, oh, my small business spent $1 million on this robot from Kawasaki, and somebody came over from Japan for a week to teach our employees how to use it. But then they went back to Japan, and now I have workers who we've hired since then, or workers who've been promoted and they don't know how to use it, right? And you might be sitting there thinking, well, I'm not teaching robotics in my adult education classroom, but you are teaching resilience and self-efficacy and a sense of agency and the ability to build from the skills people have to the skills they need, right? So maybe they're comfortable using a cell phone to send a text message or take a picture. They might not yet be comfortable with robotics, but part of what we do in adult education is help people think about how skills are transferable, right? Oh, you practice logging in using two-factor authentication to access your child's school app so you can communicate with their K-12 teacher. Guess what? When you're in the workplace, you may have to create a user account and log in with two-factor authentication. So these are things that we as adult educators are often doing already in the classroom that can help people be able to continue upskilling as the digital skill demands in their jobs change. We also heard a ton from employers about the value of hands-on experience. And this was pretty across the board, right? So employers were like, we like internships, we like externships, we like practicums, we like apprenticeship, we like pre-apprenticeship. And so this is really a call to action for those of you who are running integrated education and training programs. Is there a component of your program that's giving people an opportunity to have some real life hands-on experience? That is incredibly valuable to employers. They told us over and over again, book learning is fine, but I want people to also have some hands-on experience. And then an awful lot of employers told us, people apply to jobs for me and they have credentials on their resume that I've never heard of, and I don't know what they mean. And so this is again a very practical question of what are you teaching your own staff and what are you telling your own board of directors and your higher ups about the credentials people are earning in your programs and what they mean? If your program is helping people pass the North Star Digital Literacy Assessment, what are you contextualizing about that? If you have learners that are earning a recognized post-secondary credential in an IET type program, do they have a sentence that they can put on their resume or a sentence they can say in an interview that communicates, hey, this is a credential I earned that takes, 180 hours of instruction and it's based on a third party exam. so that an employer who sees that credential knows how to contextualize it. Because one thing we did hear from employers is if they had any kind of real connection with an education or workforce partner, they were much more likely to understand and trust the credentials that people were putting on their resume. Otherwise, they told us, very worryingly, oh, I either just disregard them completely because I don't know what to make of them, or I just take a credential as a kind of vague indicator that a person has some persistence and some, ambition, but otherwise I don't really pay attention to them, which is not a great outcome for learners who've worked really hard to earn those credentials. Perhaps no surprise, we heard from a lot of small businesses that they wanted more funding for incumbent worker training, right? How do I help my existing workers upskill? Some of you may be running workplace literacy programs that help people build English language or related skills on the job. Some of you may not be involved in that specifically, but making sure that small businesses are aware of the funding that's out there and the partners, the education partners that they can collaborate with is incredibly important. And then finally, and probably a little less relevant to you all as adult educators, is employers did ask for state agencies to build better capacity to provide some technical assistance because their sense is that large businesses do much better at accessing state funding and state education and workforce supports, and smaller businesses often kind of get left out in the cold. So those were kind of the bigger policy takeaways from the small business uh, work. I want to share with you now the practice implications. And so again, I want you to think about this information in light of what you're already doing in your classrooms to support adult learners as they think about navigating job applications, hiring, staying on the job, getting promoted on the job, problem solving on the job. Here's what we learned. I went into this thinking it would be a sort of normal bell curve of distribution, meaning a handful of employers would be really strong at hiring and skills assessment. A lot of employers would be in the middle, in the kind of fat part of the bell curve, and a few employers would be kind of lagging behind. That's not actually what we found. What we found is that about 20% of employers are what we consider leading employers. That is, they've adopted a set of strong practices around hiring and skills assessment for entry-level workers. And then a lot of businesses are still works in progress. There are more that are lagging than I anticipated when we started this research. So what does this mean for us as adult educators? I'm about to share with you what we consider the strong practices from the 20% of leading businesses. You can use that as a kind of checklist or rubric when you are reaching out to employers to potentially partner with you, either on a workplace literacy program or even just to briefly collaborate with your program to do mock interviews with your students, or to come into the classroom and talk about the jobs that they have available. So you can kind of use it as a checklist for yourselves. Um, the other thing is that none of the businesses we talk to use phrases that are common in the workforce development field and sometimes in the education field too, like job quality or good jobs or worker voice. What they said over and over again in every region of the country that we talked to was, we want to be an employer of choice in our community. And so that's the language when you as an adult educator are thinking about which businesses you might want to reach out to as partners or collaborators. You're looking for those employers of choice, that top 20%. So what are the characteristics of the top 20%? I've put the list here, and I'm going to walk through what these look like in reality because I think it's a really powerful way to help your adult learners know what good looks like when they're in the process of trying to navigate employment. The first thing seems really obvious, and yet you'd be shocked at how many businesses aren't there yet. Do they have clear, standardized job descriptions? And do those job descriptions have skills and competencies and credentials attached to them? Do they know what they're hiring for? It sounds like the most basic thing in the world, right? But a lot of businesses aren't there yet, or they're kind of only partially there. So that's a key question. And you can sometimes tell that from the outside, right? When somebody brings in a job description that they want to apply for, and you can tell that the employer has really put in the time to develop a thoughtful job description as opposed to one that might be years out of date or kind of sloppy or confusing or ambiguous. The second thing is that every employer that we talked to that fell into this top 20% category had some kind of meaningful connection to an education or workforce partner. Now, this looked really different depending on the employer, right? Some employers were really well connected to their K-12 high school career technical education program. Some were connected to a local community college. Some were connected to a local workforce board or workforce center. Some were connected to an adult education nonprofit, but they had some connection to the education and workforce systems. The third characteristic was that these small businesses were engaging in some way with their peers in industry, right? So maybe they had a Chamber of Commerce group they were part of. Maybe they had an industry sector partnership they were part of. But in some way, they were kind of stress testing their beliefs about hiring and skills with their peers, right? So you can imagine, for example, 6 local hospitals that might band together to say, oh, are you having the same challenges with hiring and retaining phlebotomists as we are? Or, hey, are you guys having a lot of turnover in your dietary aid roles? What are you doing to help dietary aides see a career ladder for themselves so they can get promoted? Um, those 20% of businesses that we talked to that were leading small businesses, they were talking with their peers. The next thing is, and this is, I think, the most interesting finding we had. Every business talked about soft skills, but the businesses that were lagging talked about soft skills as a kind of obedience or compliance thing, right? And often veering into stereotypes. So they talked about things like, oh, people just need to cover up their tattoos and pull up their pants and get off the couch and get to work. The leading businesses, the 20% of leading businesses, they talked about soft skills in terms of interpersonal skills, conflict resolution, teamwork, problem solving, critical thinking, written communication, spoken communication. And the best example of this that I talked to kind of a good old boy from a company in the South. And he said, listen, we're a lean manufacturing company. And that means we do a Gemba, which is a walkthrough. And he said, I need every employee in my company, including the janitor, to be comfortable taking the microphone when the Gemba comes around to them and talking in front of the whole company, including his coworkers, his boss, and me as CEO, and talking about how he thinks we could make the process more efficient. He said, because at some point in our lean manufacturing quality improvement process, we're going to get down to how the janitor's closet is organized. And I need that janitor to have those communication skills to be able to be in that conversation. One thing that we sometimes lose track of as adult educators is we'll talk about things like, oh, hey, our students all have level gains on the TABE, or the educational functioning level improvements are X. Those are really important metrics for federal funding. They are not important to employers. And so being able to be bilingual in how you talk about learning and skills gains and both use those sort of assessment-oriented phrases when you're in those conversations with people who are interested in NRS levels or interested in measurable skill gains under WIOA, fine. But with businesses, you have to be able to talk about what folks are learning in your class in terms that reflect what they're looking for. And so this goes back to finding number one, right? Is there a clear standardized job description with well-defined skills and competencies? Has the employer done their homework to think through what good would look like so they know what they're hiring for? Or are they hiring on some superficial assumption that, like, I just need someone who, covers up their tattoos and pulls up their pants? And we could all imagine how that translates into certain kinds of biases, right? That's not a helpful way to go about hiring people. And then finally, the 20% of leading employers also had some way for workers to provide input into key issues and a collaborative approach to solving work-life challenges, right? And that's mostly childcare and transportation. Sometimes it's also mental health, right? So one story that my colleague Lindsay found in her earlier research, not as part of this project, was there was a company that was having chronic problems with people showing up on time for the first shift. And the employer sat folks down and said, "What's going on?" Well, it turned out that the daycare drop-off time was exactly the same time as the shift start time. So, of course, everyone was late because they couldn't drop their kids off early and they couldn't leave their kids unattended waiting for daycare to open. So the employer shifted the start time of the first shift by 30 minutes, and then magically, no one was late anymore, right? So you're an adult education program. It's not your job to solve childcare or transportation issues or to help employers figure that out. But it can be your job to make friends with the people in your community who are working on these issues, right? Is there a United Way or a Goodwill or a local municipal county office that's problem solving? Oh, do we need to reroute a bus route so that the third shift workers have a bus to drop them at this major local employer? Or is there a matching child care program, right? Michigan has their TRI-Share program where employers pay one third, workers pay one third, and the state pays one third towards child care costs. So I stayed a long time on this slide because I think these findings have real power for you in how you run your classrooms and your programs and in how you talk about your work with funders and external partners. So let's talk again a little bit about how you can use these findings that I've just walked through, right? I've talked a little bit about this before. Employers often don't know what to make of credentials. The better their relationship with their local education or workforce partner, the more likely they are to trust credentials and understand what they're talking about. Um, they do hear a lot about credentials, but they're often confused, right? And so part of our job as educators can be helping them understand that better. Small businesses absolutely value foundational skills, the exact things we teach in adult basic education, high school equivalency, and adult English language learning. They value partners who put in the shoe leather to understand what they're looking for. And that 20% of businesses that have those 6 characteristics that I mentioned earlier, those are the ones who are best positioned to be allies for you, right? Because they've already done the thinking about what they're looking to hire for. So how do you use this data to advocate? Well, we as adult educators talk about this all the time, right? We understand adult learning theory within our classrooms. Think also about adult learning theory when you're dealing with your board of directors, your private foundation funders, the policymakers you're advocating with. Tell them these stories in terms that ring true to them and make sense to them in their context. Connect the dots because a lot of policymakers care deeply about small business and local economic vitality. They don't always connect the dots to how adult education is part of that. And so you can help them make those mental connections. Of course, educating local media is really important. If you have public radio stations or if there is still a local newspaper in your community, and I know many communities have been hit hard, sharing this kind of information can be really powerful in helping them understand. And again, we're in an environment where we had to fight hard for federal funding last year. We're probably going to have to fight hard again in the next budget round. The more you can prepare the ground by emphasizing the role that adult education plays in these bigger community stories, the better off our field will be. And make sure that your own board of directors, if you're at a nonprofit or if you have access to folks on your board of regents or board of trustees at the college level, do they have a couple of talking points? And it doesn't need to be more than 2 or 3 sentences about how small businesses depend on adult education. Really, really important. Our full report for the business research is available on our website. And again, you're going to get these slides afterwards, so you'll have lots of opportunity to go deeper on all of these pieces. And you'll have access to the uh, the the full data from our report. I see that we have one question in the chat. So before I go on to our learner worker research, I want to take a moment to go into that question. The question is, our workplace partners have indicated that they want numbers or data that reflect employee progress. I'm wondering if there are any ideas for satisfying this request and not referring to TABE scores or other education terms that employers don't care about. Great question. So I think the first question for you is to go back to your employer and to ask them how they're defining what good looks like, right? So depending on what kind of industry or occupation those workers are in, I'm just going to throw out a couple of examples I've seen. There are some workplace literacy programs where the employer is concerned about safety reportable incidents. They want to see that the number of safety reportable incidents has gone down. And so one output or outcome that the adult education provider could track is, are people getting more comfortable being able to read safety instructions or being able to understand oral instructions from their supervisor about how to handle materials safely or operate machinery safely? Some employers really care about customer service metrics, right? Imagine an environment where the worker is interacting a lot with the public, right? And so they're being able to kind of connect the dots to, okay, as their spoken English improves, they're more comfortable with vocabulary and additional phrases. I did work early in my career with small mom and pop immigrant owned businesses. And one of the things we taught them in their ESL classes was appreciation phrases and ways to apologize if somebody's order got screwed up. Right. So if somebody ordered chicken instead of pork and then they got the wrong thing and they were mad, we made sure that workers had phrases that could defuse customer frustrations. Right. So again, going back to your employer partners and saying, well, what would good look like to you? And then let me connect the dots between what we're doing in my classroom and how the skills that people are building are relevant to the thing that you're hoping people will achieve. And I want to be clear here. Sometimes employers are unreasonable, right? Sometimes they have an unrealistic notion of exactly how much people can learn in a certain number of hours. And I sometimes resort to talking about Duolingo in those cases. And I say, how many of you know someone who downloaded Duolingo to learn some phrases from another language before they went on vacation? And a lot of people will be like, oh, yeah. And then how many of them actually learned enough to actually communicate basically and have sort of simple customer service interactions when they were on vacation? And then a lot of people were like, well, not so much, right? And the answer is, right, when it comes to people's own learning, they recognize that, like, oh, actually, 10 or 20 hours of playing around with the Duolingo app over a couple of months before I went on my vacation did not actually make me fluent in French. So maybe, maybe my expectations that adult learners should become completely fluent in English after 30 hours of classes are similarly unrealistic, right? Um, it's a little harder with monolingual English speakers, right? When you grow up speaking a language, it's often opaque to you how challenging it can be to learn another language. Uh, but that's my answer to that question. Okay, let me do a quick time check before I take us in. Okay, perfect. We have plenty of time here. I'm going to take us now into the second half of our research, which is learner focused, and then open it up for more questions. Okay, so what do we hear from learners and workers? We know that a lot of adult learners want to pursue skills training. And so the findings from this research, we focused on people who were enrolled in some kind of short-term skills training program, right? Excuse me, we interviewed 34 people. Most of them were working age, about half were parents, they were racially diverse, and they had gone through all kinds of different job training programs. Entry-level IT jobs, healthcare, solar energy, manufacturing. People really wanted to talk to us. We got 300 applications for 35 slots. And part of that was that we were offering a $150 stipend for people's time to participate in this focus group and interview. But part of it was that people would come into these sessions and they would tell us these really vulnerable, personal, powerful stories, right? We interviewed one young man who was 22 years old. He'd been working in a food service job since he was 16. He had a single mom. She worked in food service too. They were both desperately trying to better themselves, and he had signed up for this online digital marketing class trying to be able to help small restaurants market themselves better online. Um, and people were really passionate about sharing their experiences with us in this research. So perhaps not a surprise to anyone who's ever had an adult learner in their classroom. Why do people enroll in skills training? Because they want to get a better job, they want to earn more money. And many of them also said, I want to set a good example for my kids. And I'm sure that is something that everyone in this room has heard for, hey, why'd you come back to get your GED at this point in your life? Or why'd you prioritize enrolling in this adult education program? It's not uncommon that our learners will say, my child was in school and I wanted to set a good example for them of doing homework and pursuing your goal. Or, my child just graduated from high school and I want to catch up to them and get my own high school equivalency. We also heard a lot of really disturbing stories about how people are being taken advantage of in the labor market. A lot of ghost jobs, a lot of scams. People apply for a job online, they're rejected 30 seconds later. They know that a computer rejected them and a human never saw their application. Um, they apply for a job and then they get told, oh yeah, we'll send you a check so you can buy yourself a laptop. And of course the check is going to bounce and it's going to scam them, right? Um, and so people want something better for themselves, and that's why they enroll in skills training programs. They also pick programs that are flexible and affordable. And this is a double-edged sword, right? If you're working in a low-wage job or if you're unemployed, of course you're more likely to pick a program that is free or very low cost. The problem is free or very low cost doesn't necessarily mean that it's a program that's well designed to help you get a job later. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. People also picked programs with virtual components, again, because if people were caregiving for their kids or an elder or disabled family member, they're like, well, I can do this virtually. The problem is that online only programs are much less effective in actually helping people find employment. It's not that a hybrid program can't be effective. It's that online only is much less effective. People also really tried hard to do their due diligence, right? They're like, well, how many people graduate from this program? How many of them got jobs? What kind of wages did they earn? But often that information is either not available at all or very hard to find. What did people get of their training programs? By and large, people liked their instructors, they liked the nonprofit or the community college or the other provider that had run their program, and they felt like they had really learned skills and really gained confidence. But fully a third of people had not found relevant employment or any employment at all afterwards. And of the people who had found jobs, many of them were in temporary jobs that were not permanent roles. So, what was key to actually finding a good job? This is no surprise because you saw the same slide in the employer section of the presentation. Some kind of work-based learning experience, internship, externship, practicum, pre-apprenticeship, real apprenticeship, something like that was really key. And employers having some kind of relationship with the training provider, right? We talked to a number of people who said, oh yeah, my instructor was great and she went above and beyond and she paid money out of her own pocket to make copies of the materials for us. And sometimes we didn't have space for our class and everybody had to kind of drag their chairs around to find a classroom. But actually, nobody could help me find a job later. They just sent publicly available job postings and I could have found those on my own. right? And that was not doing well by people. And then perhaps no surprise, really highly regulated fields like healthcare were more likely to lead to employment, I think because employers know what that means if they see it on your resume, right? If they see certified nurse assistant or certified nurse aide on your resume as a credential, they know what that means. If they see Google career certificate for digital marketing, do they know what that means? Often no, right? So, what are the takeaways for adult educators? It is really powerful to build even lightweight relationships with businesses. And I know many of you are already doing that, especially if you're running an IET program, but it's really worth prioritizing. Um, Making sure that your program data is available to folks, right? If any of you are also WIOA Title I providers, you're probably familiar with the eligible training provider list and the data that people can access to see, hey, if I go through this, truck driving training program or this, home health aid training program, what's the graduation rate? What's the wage I'm earning? But for a lot of other programs, that data isn't publicly available. So you can do your part to make sure that data is more easily available for people. And then making sure that people have access to supportive services like childcare and transportation when they're in adult education programs, right? It's not that your program has to be responsible for funding this or providing it, but you should be, to the best of your ability, in conversation with the organizations and the groups in your community who are tackling this as their priority issue and who might be able to offer resources or referrals or other supports to your learners. And then finally, if you are running an IET program, think about how you can connect learners with work-based learning opportunities. And I'm not going to belabor this point because I've talked about it a lot already. It's on the slide. You can refer back to it at the end of our presentation when you get these slides. But I just wanted to mention it one last time. Many of you are already braiding lots of different funding streams. The more that can happen to make skills training free or affordable to learners, the better. There was just a report out today, or this week rather, that says delinquency rates for student borrowing have gone from 9% before the pandemic in 2019 to 25% now. And a lot of adult learners have already tried to make some attempt at prior education and are already in debt. So the degree to which you can make your programs as accessible as possible, the better for them. And then, of course, I know many of you are probably dealing with this already. There are changes because of the bill that Congress passed last summer around more work requirements for people who are enrolled in SNAP or Medicaid. Many adult learners are low income. Many are in these programs. They may need to meet work requirements of 20 hours a week, and being able to have paperwork from your program that can show that participating in adult education can help them meet those requirements is really powerful. There's more about our findings from the student and worker survey here. And I'm going to open things up now for questions for the last 15 minutes of my portion. And then there'll be an additional 15-minute presentation following my portion of this conversation. I'm also, my contact information is on the slide here, but I'm going to stop sharing slides in a minute, just so we can all see each other. And I will put my contact info in the chat as well. Okay. So I'm opening up for questions, but I also want to encourage you, if you want to brag about your program, I'd also love to hear that because I talk to people all over the country. I'll be in Connecticut next month and then in Nevada and then in California. I'd love to be able to talk about what Wisconsin is doing well. So don't be shy about either today or via email or phone call later, following up with me to tell me about really cool stuff that you're doing. Okay. Let's open it up for questions. And meanwhile, I'm going to put my contact info in the chat. Okay. All right. I haven't yet seen questions coming through, so I will say, oh, here we go. How do you work to improve EQ for non-English speakers to make a workforce experience successful? I just want to clarify, Karen, are you talking about EQ as in emotional intelligence or something else? I just want to make sure I'm understanding the question here. Um, And again, while we're waiting for Karen, I'll also say if any of you have employer partners that you're already working with, that you feel free, first of all, to share this research with them. But secondly, if you think it would be helpful for me to present this information to employer audiences, I'm also more than happy to do that. I do a million presentations and I'm happy to add to my calendar. Okay, so I haven't yet seen the clarification from Karen. In the meantime, I will say, um, being able to start with the pain point that people are experiencing and work backwards from that can be really powerful, right? So what brought this person into your classroom? I want a better life for my kids. I want to earn more money. Okay. Can I take you back? Um, yeah, can I take you backwards and think about how building these kinds of skills in the classroom can help you achieve those bigger goals? Sometimes hooking things to people's bigger picture aspirations and dreams can help them understand and internalize things that are not immediately obvious. In terms of interpersonal dynamics in the workforce, one thing that I used to do a lot when I was working with immigrant adult learners is talk about it like a code, right? So it's not that the code that you grew up with in your home country is wrong or bad. It's that you're in the US now and you need to learn a different code in order to be successful in what you're trying to achieve, right? So in your home country, it might have been respectful to keep your eyes downcast at all times and not look people in the eye, to, um, you know, uh, work in a workplace where there were never any women as bosses, for example, or to work in a workplace where it was considered really bad manners to take personal credit for achievements. In the US, it's often considered rude not to look people in the eye. It's often considered weird not to brag about your own individual accomplishments in a job interview. It's very common that you will have a boss of a different gender, right? And so this is about learning the codes that can help you be successful in this current environment and then hooking it back to their larger aspiration, right? Your aspiration is to do well by your children. Your aspiration is to be able to earn more money. I'm teaching you the codes that will help you do that, as opposed to getting stuck in a conversation about, well, I don't like this, or I don't think it's fair, or, sure. I will also say that there are valuable worker rights curriculums and workforce safety curriculums that have been developed by nonprofit organizations and labor unions. And depending on the context of your learners, that might be valuable information for them, right? So the federal government, the Department of Labor has something in the Occupational Safety and Health Administration called the Susan Harwood grants. And these are grants that often go to nonprofit organizations to teach worker safety, right? How do I teach roofers about fall prevention? How do I teach agricultural workers about safely handling pesticides and other chemicals? These curricula are publicly and freely available on the federal government's website because that's a condition of these grants, right? And so you're sitting here thinking, well, no one's giving out these grants under this administration. That may very well be true. But people have given out these grants in the past, and there are publicly available curricula, and some of those curricula are multilingual. And they can be really valuable for you as an adult educator to say, okay, can I pull a couple of pieces from this to help my learners understand either why is this supposedly unfair thing happening in my workplace and I can help them see the reasoning behind it, or maybe a genuinely unfair thing is happening and I can give you some tools to think about talking to your coworkers and going to your manager as a group and saying, hey, we don't think this is clear or fair or safe or whatever. And I will drop the link to the training grant curricula into the chat in just a minute. Um, So we have about 6 or 7 minutes left. I just want to make sure that if anybody has any pending questions, that you have a moment to ask them. In the meantime, I am, oopsie daisies. Okay. Uh, Looking at the Susan Harwood training program and they usually have a list of, let's see, training training resources. Okay, here we go. This page should get you. Yeah, here we go. Perfect. Okay. I'm gonna drop that link into the chat. Um, okay. For assessing learner success to employers paying for a workplace English partnership, do you recommend providing surveys so that students can report their own improvements, or that we create custom assessments related to the curriculum and studied objectives? We have a current partner that likes to use standardized testing, even though it has very little to do with the workplace specific English that's being taught. So this is partly a capacity question for you, right? What do you as an organization have the ability to do? If you have teacher or staff capacity to develop custom assessments, even if it's a little quick 4 or 5 question pre and post rubric that folks can self-administer, that can be powerful, right? And you can present that alongside the standardizing test data to demonstrate to the employer that actually there might be other ways to better measure the kinds of gains they want to see. Maybe you don't have that capacity, right? Sometimes that is the case. A question then might be, do you have the capacity to hire or contract with a graduate student who could do a semester-long project and maybe do a half a dozen or a dozen interviews anonymously with your participants and get some qualitative data about, hey, how has this class changed things for you? Oh, you've always wanted to work during the day so that you could be home with your kids at night, but your English wasn't good enough to work on the day shift. And now this class has let you, transfer to the day shift and it's made a huge difference for you. Or, oh, you were about to quit because you felt like this job wasn't a good fit for you and you would have added to your employer's already very high turnover numbers. But this class has made you more likely to stay because it made you feel like your employer cared about you and wanted to invest in you. Sometimes that kind of qualitative data can help employers understand the kind of holistic picture of what adult education is bringing to people, and it rounds out the data that they're seeing in a standardized test. And sometimes employers are just going to be fixated on the standardized test and you can't talk them out of it. And honestly, sometimes a standardized test is useful. I'm not going to say that they're not, but they're one tool in the toolbox. I like to say it's like the Phillips head screwdriver, right? If what you need is a Phillips head, it's super useful, but you can't build a house all by itself, all by yourself with only a Phillips head screwdriver, right? You need the hammer, you need the nails, you need all the other tools and pieces of equipment. Okay. All right, one last question. Oh, I'm just seeing Caitlin's comment. Okay. The other thing I will also say is stalk other states' adult education professional development websites, particularly Texas, California, Massachusetts, and Minnesota, because as awesome as Wisconsin is, some of those states are a lot bigger than Wisconsin and have a lot of money. California puts about $5 into their adult education system for every $1 that the feds put in. Um, you can you can borrow their freely available professional development resources, which often include rubrics or measures or examples of how other programs have gone about that. But again, I would focus on Texas and California because they're very big and have good resources, and then Massachusetts and Minnesota because they've been funding nonprofit PD partners to the adult ed system for a long time, and supporting the development of resources. So, you know, round out your wonderful Wisconsin resources by stealing some from other friendly states, and seeing what they have to offer in terms of support. Massachusetts in particular has a couple of grants that are administered by the Commonwealth Corporation, which is a quasi-governmental agency. And they're the Workforce Transformation Grant and the Workforce, I forget what. And often they will report on those grants. They're not exclusively adult ed grants, but they often end up serving adult learners. Um, and sometimes you might see someone who's administering a program similar to what you're doing, and you can pick up the phone and talk to them. And so actually the last thing I'm going to do, I'm going to pull up for you now. Years ago, I wrote a blog post about a really cool Massachusetts program. So it was an employer that wanted to do lean manufacturing training for their workers. And then they realized that they had a lot of English language learners in their workforce. And they couldn't just throw those people into a program where they would suddenly be faced with terms like Six Sigma and lean manufacturing. Um, and Gemba, right? And so what they did was they worked with English for New Bostonians, which is a nonprofit adult ed provider, to develop a pre-lean ESOL class for their English language learners to take in the summer before the fall class for lean manufacturing started, so that the ELL participants could be on equal footing with their English speaking peers when the class started. And I just dropped in the blog post about that. Okay. We are coming up on 12:15 Central, and that means it is the end of my portion of the presentation. I'm going to bring up the slides one more time because there is actually a survey form that we very much hope you will take a moment to fill out. Let me make this full screen here. I am always looking for feedback on my presentation, so please feel free to be frank about my presentation. And of course, there's another 15-minute additional part of this session that we'll be transitioning to in a moment. So let me turn things over to Robin for that transition,
Okay.
and we'll
Thank
move on.
you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Amanda. We really appreciate it. If you want to show her some love in the chat by using one of the many emojis, that would be very nice.